Welcome, and settle in for a slow journey through candlelight, polished floors, folded letters, and the long, quiet turning of a life inside history. Tonight, the story can move more slowly, through softer rooms and smaller turns, without hurrying toward its hardest hour. It can unfold more gently than that. It begins where silk rustled in mirrored rooms, where rank could be measured by who stood nearest a chair, where an entire kingdom disguised itself as ceremony, and where a young girl crossed a border and slowly disappeared into a name that was never entirely her own. If you are listening at the end of a long day, let the walls around you soften. Let the room become dimmer in the mind. Imagine candlelight moving along gilt frames and reflecting back in long pale lines from glass. Imagine corridors where footsteps are muffled by carpets, doors that open on whispered bows, and windows beyond which the night remains cool and distant. This is the world we are entering. It glitters, it suffocates, it teaches people to smile while they are being watched. And somewhere inside it, a child from Austria will be remade into the woman history prefers to remember as a symbol. But a symbol is not the same thing as a person. A symbol is useful. A person is inconvenient. A symbol can be hated cleanly. A person is always more mixed, more unfinished, more lonely than a crowd would like. So tonight, as the story opens, the story can keep returning to the human room beneath the public one. Beneath the queen, there will be a daughter, then a wife, then a mother, then a prisoner, then finally, only a woman waking into one last morning. That last morning need not be held too tightly. We will let it arrive through smaller things first. A river crossing, a change of clothes, a carriage wheel turning over a road, the faint scent of wax and starch and cold air. In the spring of 1770, the girl, still called Marie Antoinette, stood at the threshold of an arranged future. She was 14, the daughter of Maria Theresa, raised inside one imperial world and about to be given to another. No battle decided it, no dramatic prophecy announced it. The transfer of her life was done by a treaty, carriage, etiquette, and the old diplomatic habit of moving daughters across Europe like living bridges between uneasy powers. She had been taught music, movement, courtesy, enough religion to sound dutiful, enough conversation to seem pleasant, and almost nothing that might prepare a child for becoming public property. On the island in the river where Austria ended and France began, the ritual was staged with unnerving precision. Everything Austrian had to remain behind. The body that had belonged to one court must be redressed for another. Fabric, pins, attendants, language, and familiar objects all fell away in sequence, as though identity itself could be dismantled by careful hands. Even the small sentimental comforts of girlhood were denied continuation. The message was unmistakable. You do not travel into France carrying a previous self. You arrive as something newly made. There's a sadness in these royal ceremonies that often hides behind lace and protocol. A peasant girl leaving home might at least carry a basket, a shawl, a memory stitched into use. A princess could be given jewels and still be allowed less. Marie Antoinette passed through that ritual like a page being lifted from one book and pressed into another. When she emerged, French silk lay where Austrian cloth had been, and the name that would follow her into history already hovered nearby. Marie Antoinette, even before she saw Versailles, she had learned the first rule of monarchy, that the body of a royal woman belonged to politics before it belonged to herself. The journey onward was cushioned, ornamented, and controlled. Officials arranged the road like scenery. Towns looked prosperous where she passed. Faces smiled where she could see them. Order, beauty, and abundance were selected for presentation. Yet outside the scripted route lay another France altogether, one less polished and less forgiving, where bread mattered more than pageantry, and where a queen, once formed, would be measured against emptiness she had not been permitted to witness. For now, though, the carriage rolled through sunlight, and the girl inside it looked forward into a future she had not chosen and could not yet imagine. Versailles did not greet newcomers as a home. It received them as a system. Before one understood its architecture, one felt its logic. Doors did not simply open. They opened according to rank. People did not merely gather, they assembled by privilege. Rooms were not neutral spaces, but hierarchies made visible in floorboards, curtains, duels, and proximity. At first glance, it was only magnificence. Chandeliers, mirrored walls, marble, brocade, painted ceilings, fountains, and the endless reflective confidence of a monarchy that had spent generations teaching Europe what splendor should look like. But beneath the glitter lay discipline, mourning itself unfolded by ceremony. Who entered first, who stood closest, who handed which garment, who was permitted to sit, who waited, who watched. These things were not trivial to Versailles. They were the structure by which power was distributed and dependency maintained. Nobles who might otherwise have governed provinces or raised opposition instead competed for access to shoes, sleeves, and glances. The palace made vanity into governance. It rewarded attendance over usefulness and transformed adult aristocrats into careful satellites revolving around ritual. For someone raised in a comparatively warmer court, the French version of intimacy could feel like frost disguised as lace. Marie Antoinette, barely more than a child, found herself at the center of this machine. She was expected to be visible but not spontaneous, admired but not legible, fertile but not bodily, foreign enough to cement an alliance yet French enough to symbolize the kingdom. It was too much for anyone, especially for someone young, undereducated in politics, and starved of privacy. And then there was the marriage itself, which should have anchored her, and instead increased the sense of unreality. Louis Auguste was shy, awkward, inward, and ill at ease within his own role. He was not cruel, he was simply unready, embarrassed by intimacy, more comfortable with locks and metalwork than with the emotional demands of partnership. The court, naturally, made sport of what it could not openly discuss. Silence in the royal bedchamber became a matter of public curiosity. Delay became speculation. Speculation became print. The private uncertainty of two young people was translated into a national theater of gossip. At court, a marriage did not belong to the spouses. It belonged to lineage, succession, and the appetite of onlookers. So the queen learned another rule of her world. Where ordinary people suffered privately and were ignored, royal people suffered publicly and were interpreted. In that difference, there was no real comfort. When ease does not exist, people begin to construct smaller versions of it. Marie Antoinette found relief where she could. In music, in cards, in friendship, in late hours when ceremony loosened a little. In fabrics that answered the senses if nothing else would. In hairstyles elaborate enough to turn the head into architecture and perhaps distract the mind from the room around it. Much has been written with easy scorn about her gowns, her powder, her jewels, her evenings, her appetite for display. Yet, indulgence at court was never only pleasure. It was often a narcotic against enclosure. The hours after midnight could feel truer than the hours of state. Candles lowered, voices softened, tables gathered around games. Laughter briefly replaced choreography. In such rooms, the queen could imagine herself as someone among companions rather than an emblem under observation. But luxury is dangerous medicine when offered to a restless spirit inside an unequal society. What feels like temporary relief to the one enclosed appears, from outside, as thoughtless abundance. The same silk that soothed her became evidence against her. The same nights that gave her escape became signs of decadence in the public imagination. Every gesture within Versailles had an echo beyond its walls, and that echo was growing louder. Friendship, too, became politically charged the moment it became visible. The queen's closeness to the Polignac circle, and especially to Yolande Polignac, offered her something court life rarely did: warmth without constant calculation, or at least the illusion of it. Here were people before whom she could relax her posture, lower her guard, and act less like an institution. But in a place where favor meant offices, pensions, access, and influence, affection could not remain innocent in appearance. Gifts became corruption, companionship became faction, tenderness became intrigue. The court read intimacy as strategy because it no longer believed that unstrategic attachment was possible. So while the queen moved toward people who felt real, The world around her increasingly treated those movements as proof of selfishness, foreign cliquishness, or moral looseness. Rumor works best when it attaches itself to something half-true. She did prefer a smaller circle. She did seek escape. She did bestow favor. She did not understand how profoundly such acts would be resented in a kingdom already straining under burdens that court life barely perceived. Yet to say that is not the same as saying the public version of her was accurate. It was only beginning to harden, and once a public version hardens, it becomes easier to inhabit than truth. The Petit Trianon was one of the clearest expressions of this contradiction. To Marie Antoinette, it was a retreat, a smaller world where the suffocation of rank could be softened. There, paths curved more gently, gardens seemed less ceremonial, and rooms invited private feeling rather than state display. She could breathe, or seem to. She could choose company more freely. She could walk without the full weight of Versailles behind each movement. And perhaps most fatally of all, she could play at simplicity. The fantasy of simplicity has always belonged most easily to those protected from its actual conditions. In the Queen's small refuge, rustic life was not mud and hunger, but polished wood, carefully designed gardens, selected animals, milk served in porcelain, shepherdess costumes cut from expensive fabric, and an entire architecture of innocence funded by privilege. As personal therapy, it may have been understandable. As political optics, it was a disaster waiting to be narrated by enemies. A woman whom the people imagined surrounded by excess was now also playing at the lives they themselves endured without any costume to remove at dusk. And then motherhood altered the emotional geometry of her life. Royal births were less intimate beginnings than public ceremonies of legitimacy. Crowds pressed too close. Bodies were inspected by protocol. Relief itself had witnesses, yet once her children were born, something in Marie Antoinette's attention shifted inward. She became, by many accounts, more serious, more attached, more desirous of private domestic time than of courtly display. She wished to be with her children not as a queen producing heirs for the state, but as a mother arranging hours. Lessons, walks, songs, and small protections. This desire should have humanized her in public imagination. Instead, it deepened the split between the woman she was becoming and the image already being made of her. Withdrawal into the nursery or the Petit Trianon did not read as moral growth to a suspicious public. It read as further negligence, further indulgence, further proof that the Austrian woman cared for private comforts while France suffered. One of the cruelties of history is that human change often arrives after the story around a person has already fixed itself. Marie Antoinette was growing in directions her enemies would never bother to see. Print made that blindness durable in pamphlets, gossip sheets, songs, and whispered retellings. The Queen became easier to consume than to understand. Her spending, her friendships, her foreign birth, her beauty, her failures, her pleasures, her maternity, even her body itself were arranged into a political character called the Austrian woman. This was no longer a person with habits and blind spots. It was a vessel for fear, resentment, and fantasy. She was greedy because the state was strained. She was sexually disordered because female power disturbed. She was disloyal because Traria remained emotionally imaginable behind her face. She was frivolous because a nation in pain prefers moral explanation to structural analysis. The machinery of attack worked so well because it did not invent from nothing. It selected, enlarged, stylized, and repeated. She did spend. She did retreat into private amusements. She did favor intimates. She did correspond with family abroad. Yet each fact was bent until it fitted a pre-existing need. The more France struggled, the more useful it became to make suffering legible through one visible woman. Tax exemptions, war debt, harvest failures, administrative corruption, elite privilege, and structural inequity are not easy to hate in a satisfying way. A queen in silk is. Then came the diamond necklace affair. absurd enough to seem invented and devastating enough to outlive its own facts. A prince of the church hungry for favor, forged letters, a woman in the dark, mistaken for the queen, jewelers on the edge of ruin, and a necklace glittering with enough concentrated wealth to symbolize everything the age wanted to condemn. Marie Antoinette did not engineer the fraud. She did not even desire the necklace in the way rumor claimed. But innocence is weak protection once the public imagination has already been trained toward spectacle. In the affair's logic, disbelief itself became suspicious. The more she denied, the more the denial sounded aristocratic. What mattered was not the court verdict, nor the technical allocation of guilt. What mattered was narrative momentum. The public could now imagine the queen as criminal, in addition to being vain, foreign, and indulgent. The affair created a frame into which every future accusation could slide more easily. And history, once framed badly, becomes very difficult to straighten. From this point onward, the image of Marie Antoinette began moving faster than the woman herself could ever hope to catch. By the late 1780s, France was not simply displeased with its monarchy. It was fraying under burdens that ceremony could no longer disguise. Debt had become a climate. Bread prices rose like pressure in the chest. Harvest failure was not theoretical when it arrived at the table as absence. The state paid for old wars with future suffering. Taxation fell hardest where protection was thinnest. Privilege exempted those most able to contribute and asked endurance of those least able to provide it. Such conditions do not automatically produce revolution, but they create a landscape in which symbols ignite more easily. Against this background, the queen's image grew more useful. She was expensive to imagine, and therefore useful to blame. Her gowns became the nation's deficits in miniature. Her entertainments were recited beside empty ovens. Her retreat into selected privacy looked like aristocratic indifference to the weather of ordinary life. Much of this was unfair if taken literally. She had not designed the tax system. She had not created the inherited structure of privilege. She did not direct finance with the power attributed to her. Yet scapegoats are chosen precisely because they stand close enough to the center to absorb anger while remaining human enough to despise. The Estates General, when finally summoned, brought together a kingdom's contradictions under one roof. To the court it could still appear as ceremony, inconvenience, or managed renewal. To many in the Third Estate, it was the long-delayed opening through which historical grievance might finally become political speech. Here Marie Antoinette's tragedy deepened through incomprehension. She was not a grand strategist standing in command of reaction. She was, rather, someone who did not understand how completely the language of deference had broken. She still lived inside the assumption that monarchy, if challenged, would somehow reassert itself through dignity, continuity, or force applied at the correct moment. But the age of automatic deference was ending once the Bastille fell. The atmosphere changed irreversibly. Even before one knew what each event meant, one felt the loss of return. Rooms that had once contained anxiety as gossip now held it as weather. Every messenger carried more than news. He carried evidence that the old forms no longer organized reality. The Queen, for all the criticism directed at her, was still a human being feeling these changes through sound, silence, delay, posture, and the altered behavior of those around her. Revolution often enters a palace first as misaligned ceremony. People bow differently, voices lower or sharpen, servants hesitate, windows feel more exposed. There is a new draft in the room. The women's march to Versailles closed the symbolic distance between hunger and splendor more vividly than any pamphlet ever could. Women left Paris with bread on their minds and anger in their limbs. Rain, mud, exhaustion, and necessity accompanied them. They did not need court language to explain themselves. Their bodies on the road were explanation enough. When they reached the palace, history crossed a threshold as surely as the young bride had once crossed the river island years before. Only this crossing came not in silken protocol, but in weather and urgency. Night within Versailles became charged, brittle, porous. Glass broke, footsteps multiplied. The private apartments were no longer secure. simply because they belonged to royalty. In one of the most psychologically decisive moments of the revolution, the royal family's domestic space was entered by those whom the monarchy had for too long held at ceremonial distance. This mattered as much symbolically as politically. The body of the queen, once guarded by curtains, etiquette, and architecture, had become imaginable as accessible. Morning brought the balcony, the children, the crowd, the demanded gesture of submission. Much has been made of the curtsy, the composure, the momentary turning of fury. What matters for our slower telling is the shift in scale it represents. Versailles, which had once seemed to organize the entire horizon of her life, suddenly became smaller than the crowd beneath it. The queen no longer stood above public feeling, she stood inside it. Soon afterward she would leave Versailles for Paris, and in leaving, abandon forever the space that had made and imprisoned her. Paris did not offer freedom, it offered a narrower cage under sharper observation. The Tuileries replaced endless ritual with constant surveillance. The family was still technically royal, but the grammar of power had changed. Letters were watched, visitors filtered, movements noted. The old distances between sovereign and subject, between private and public, between family life and political theater, continued to shrink. Each day removed another layer of assumed safety. The monarchy was not yet dead, but it was living on terms dictated increasingly by those who wished to end it. In such conditions, the desire to flee was both understandable and catastrophic. Varenne, the failed flight, was not merely a practical failure of timing and disguise. It was the moment at which suspicion hardened into conviction for many who had still wavered. To attempt escape was to confirm, in the public mind, disloyalty to the nation that now claimed sovereignty over crown and queen alike. When the family was brought back, the road itself had changed its meaning. Once the young bride had traveled toward France as a promise. Now the queen returned through it as a repudiated figure. The same land can carry opposite stories, depending on who is watching from the roadside. By the time the royal family entered the temple prison, the symbolism of gold had given way to the blunt reality of stone. There's a spiritual violence in reduction. A woman accustomed to wide rooms, controlled appearances, and mediated access is placed within damp walls, under the gaze of guards who measure humiliation in inches. Furniture becomes scant, light becomes conditional, time loses eventfulness and is reassembled from small repetitive acts. Washing, mending, teaching, waiting, listening, hoping not to hear a key turn for the wrong reason. Yet it is often in reduction that the most durable self appears. Deprived of ceremonial identity, Marie Antoinette's life narrowed toward what could still be cared for. Her children, her husband's failing morale, the management of fear, the attempt to preserve tenderness where power had evaporated. This is one reason the later prison sections of her life carry such force. The queen whom pamphlets had inflated into monstrosity becomes, in confinement, more recognizably human than ever. She worries about cold, hunger, lessons, sleep, illness, and emotional damage. Empire disappears, motherhood remains. The execution of Louis XVI did not only make her a widow, it stripped away another layer of shared role. Their marriage had never been an easy haven, but in prison, even the incomplete bond between them had become a form of companionship against the state. His death left her in a loneliness no court ritual had prepared her to bear. Worse still was what followed for the children. The revolution, which claimed new moral authority, proved capable of brutal intimacy. To separate a mother from her children, to manipulate a boy, to invade the family as if it were a political archive to be broken open. These acts revealed a new kind of violence, one less theatrical than the scaffold, and in some ways more chilling. Here, the sleep-friendly telling must move with special care. We do not need to dwell on every cruelty in order to understand its shape. It is enough to say that the queen's maternal world was systematically dismantled. The child she loved became an instrument in the making of charges. The daughter who remained became another ache, another reason to endure, and another reason to despair. Letters became precious precisely because they might never arrive. A room became unbearable precisely because it held so little, and yet could not protect what mattered most. There were still, even here, return points into softness. A scrap of needlework, a child's voice before it changed, the folding of paper, the instinct to instruct, comfort, or remember, a prison is not only made of walls, it is also made of whatever small acts resist the wall's intention. In this narrowed life, the queen, who had once seemed to live only on surfaces, was learning depth too late to save herself, and just in time to be seen differently by history. The trial that followed was called justice and staged as explanation, but it functioned as theater. The verdict existed in appetite before it existed in law. Charges assembled themselves around the image already prepared for public consumption. Foreign schemer, corrupter of court, enemy of France, deviant woman, false mother, political serpent wrapped in silk. It is one of the dark efficiencies of propaganda that once enough people have practiced hating an invented version of a person, institutions can step forward and codify that invention. The conciergerie tightened everything further. Small cell, constant gaze, thin food, rough routines, the body declining under strain. Yet from inside this reduction came some of the clearest evidence of her transformation. She wrote with greater seriousness. She reflected with less vanity. She could no longer hide from suffering, and because she could not hide, she was finally compelled to speak from a self not constructed by decorum. Even her defenders had too little room to work. The process was overwhelmed by its own predetermined purpose. To acquit her would not merely free a woman. It would fracture the story the revolution had told about itself. And still, at the center of the theater, a person spoke. She denied what was false, admitted what was real, and met obscenity with a dignity all the more striking because it appeared where the courtroom expected collapse. There are moments in history when a voice becomes clear precisely because it is surrounded by noise that cannot bear clarity. Her reply to the most monstrous accusations, especially those that touched motherhood, cut through the theater not because it saved her, but because it briefly reminded everyone in the room that there remained a line between political necessity and moral indecency. The verdict ignored that line. History eventually did not. The final night carries its own hush. A woman writes letters she suspects may be intercepted, destroyed, or never read until long after meaning can no longer alter events. She thinks of children who will grow without her. She thinks of the husband already gone. She thinks of forgiveness, not because the age deserves it, but because hatred would now serve nothing except the continuation of what has already destroyed her. Forgiveness in such circumstances is not softness. It is the refusal to let the persecutor govern the interior life completely. By morning, so many identities have fallen away that only gesture remains. The white dress, the cut hair, the bound hands, the cart, the route, the crowd, the physical facts are simple, even plain. Public death is often administratively ordinary in its preparation. What gives it force is the moral weather surrounding it. Paris had come to see a queen die. Many expected fear or pleading, perhaps the visible collapse of pride. Instead, they received steadiness, and steadiness, in the face of orchestrated humiliation, can become a kind of accusation. The famous apology to the executioner matters because it is so small. Not an oration, not a grand pronouncement, a reflex of courtesy under extremity. She stepped on his foot and said, "Pardon." Such moments survive because they do what political language often cannot. They reveal the settled habits of a soul. A person can rehearse a speech. She cannot easily fabricate instinct in the final seconds before death. Whatever Marie Antoinette had been in all the disputed years before, whatever blindnesses or extravagances or failures marked her life, the woman at the scaffold was no longer merely the caricature her enemies required. The blade fell, the body ended, and the crowd responded with the noise public executions demand. Yet noise and satisfaction are not always the same thing. Symbolic deaths promise too much. They claim to resolve suffering by concentrating blame. But bread does not become cheaper because a queen dies well. Structural inequity does not vanish because a head is raised to cheering witnesses. If anything, the gap between promised purification and continued hardship becomes more visible once the spectacle concludes. This is one reason her death continued to haunt rather than settle the revolutionary imagination. It had not solved what it claimed to solve. What followed for the children is among the saddest proofs of that failure. The revolution had justified itself partly in moral language, yet it left young lives in ruin. The son deteriorated. The daughter endured imprisonment and trauma. The family line that had once symbolized dynastic continuity shrank into illness, isolation, and broken memory. Europe looked on with a mixture of horror, calculation, grief, and opportunism. Monarchs saw not only a woman's death, but a precedent. Clergy saw martyrdom. Propagandists saw material. Exiles saw a wound to build politics around. The queen, finally gone, became newly useful to everyone. This afterlife is part of the story, but for our sleep retelling it must remain softer than polemic. We do not need to follow every later argument to understand the pattern. In death, Marie Antoinette became more symbolically potent than she had ever been in life. Revolutionaries needed her monstrous, royalists needed her saintly. Romantics needed her tragic. Historians would eventually try to recover the person pressed flat beneath all these uses. None succeeded entirely. Perhaps no one can, once a human being becomes a historical screen for collective fear and longing. Some part of the original figure is always obscured. Still, not all is lost in that obscurity. Certain images survive the centuries with unusual steadiness. The border island, the mirrors of Versailles, the small refuge of Trianon, the anxious mother, the stone cell, the folded letter, the white dress, the apology. These are not enough to solve her, but they are enough to keep her from dissolving completely into propaganda. They let us approach, not a saint or monster, but a woman late in understanding and real in suffering. So now, as the story begins to dim, let us return to its two great chambers. First, the gilded cage, a palace breathing candle smoke and vanity. Designed to dazzle Europe and occupy nobility, lined with mirrors that multiplied every surface while hiding the absence of privacy. Then the stone cell, smaller than memory, poor in furniture, sharp with cold, its window allowing only a strained version of light. One space too ornamented to tell the truth, the other too bare to conceal it. Between those two rooms stretches the life we have followed tonight. If we listen closely, beneath the noise of scandal and the after-arguments of politics, we can hear another story altogether. A foreign child made into a national emblem, a young woman seeking escape in surfaces because no honest ease was available to her. A mother trying, imperfectly but sincerely, to protect affection within institutions designed to consume it. A public image hardening until it no longer resembled the person wearing it. A prisoner reduced by history until the interior self, strangely, began to clarify. This does not absolve her failures. It simply returns proportion to them. The lesson here is quieter than revolution and less tidy than judgment. Societies in a strain often search for a face to carry their rage. Once they find one, they decorate it with every fear already waiting in the culture. Foreignness, femininity, waste, desire, excess, disloyalty. The face becomes explanatory. The person beneath it becomes inaccessible. Marie Antoinette happened to live and die inside one of history's clearest examples of that transformation. That is part of why her story continues to feel modern. We still know how quickly image outruns truth, and yet, for all that, the story leaves behind not only warning, but a kind of low, persistent light. Dignity was not supposed to belong to her at the end. It was supposed to belong to the cause that killed her. Instead, in one of history's moral reversals, the composure of the condemned exposed the hunger of the crowd more clearly than the crowd exposed the crimes of the condemned. Grace entered where spectacle expected degradation. That does not redeem the old regime, nor erase the injustices that made revolution thinkable. It simply insists that even in terrible political weather, the human person may exceed the story built to destroy her. Let the palace grow quieter now. Let the mirrors darken. Let the prison corridor empty. Let the folded letters rest where they are. Let the cartwheels recede into distance. Let the name remain, but only faintly, no longer shouted by pamphleteers or mourned by partisans. Only drifting through history with the softer weight of someone who lived badly in some ways, blindly in others, and yet met the end with a steadiness that history could not fully take from her. And if you are ready for sleep, let the last image be small and simple. A pale morning, a white sleeve, a quiet apology, and then only the dimming of the room. There was another cruelty hidden inside Versailles, one less visible than mirrors, and not as memorable as diamonds, yet constant as breathing. Nothing in court life was allowed to remain proportionate. A pause became a rumor, a preference became an alignment, a friendship became a faction, a delayed pregnancy became a national concern. People who had no work that mattered were forced to make significance out of the tiny and the ceremonial. And in such an environment, exaggeration was not an accident, but a habit. For a young queen, unused to that atmosphere, the temptation was either to perform harder or to retreat further. Marie Antoinette did a little of both, and both choices were costly. The daily dressing ritual alone could have taught a patient observer almost everything about the old regime. A body stood at the center, but sovereignty did not rest in the body. It rested in the choreography around it. Garments became offices. Touch became rank. Waiting became competition. The absurdity is easy for modern eyes to mock, yet the deeper truth is more unsettling. Systems that seem foolish often survive because their foolishness is useful. Versailles wasted talent by design. It prevented people from asking large questions by drowning them in small humiliations and small honors. Once Marie Antoinette understood this even dimly, no wonder she sought rooms where the costume might briefly loosen. But every private loosening at court had a public cost. The queen discovered that authenticity itself could look offensive when performed by a privileged body. If she wore too much splendor, she seemed vain. If she played at simplicity, she seemed insulting. If she withdrew for peace, she seemed indifferent. If she sought company, she seemed corrupt. If she remained formal, she seemed cold. This is one reason the story becomes tragic rather than merely cautionary. The field around her had narrowed so greatly that almost any movement could be recruited into blame. That fact does not make all choices equally wise. It does make them more intelligible. At moments like this in history, people often imagine that one better decision might have altered everything. Perhaps less spending, fewer favorites, more visible charity, better political education, earlier seriousness. There is truth in some of that. Yet it is also true that Marie Antoinette had entered a structure already decaying under forces much larger than her temperament. She could accelerate resentment by embodying privilege poorly. She could not by herself dissolve the debt, reform the tax system, repair harvest failures, reconcile elite exemption with popular hardship, or teach an entire monarchy how to appear morally credible in an age increasingly hungry for representation. Her mistakes mattered. They simply did not matter alone. This is why the making of a scapegoat is so alluring. It turns complexity into drama. It lets a crowd believe that moral purification can stand in for structural change. The queen's face, her dresses, her expenditures, her foreign accent, her household, and her friendships offered a theater of blame that felt immediate, visual, and satisfying. Structural finance is invisible. A satin sleeve is not. A debt instrument does not attend an opera. A queen does. History is full of such substitutions. We suffer under systems and punish the person whose visibility best condenses them. The diamond necklace affair deserves lingering because it reveals how a reputation works once it has been loosened from truth. The story itself has the absurd texture of a night garden comedy gone foul, a vain cardinal longing for restored favor, forged letters written in a queen's voice, a woman dressed to resemble royalty from a useful distance, jewelers desperate enough to trust fantasy, and a necklace extravagant enough to represent an age eating itself through display. In another court, or another century, the whole thing might have become a private embarrassment. In France, it became moral theater, Cardinal de Rohan's gullibility was not merely personal stupidity. It was the vanity of a world trained to confuse access with intimacy. He believed he could be secretly significant to the Queen because the court had taught everyone to believe significance arrives through favor, proximity, and whispered exception. Jeanne de la Motte, with all her appetite and improvisation, understood that weakness perfectly. She offered him not only deception, but a role and a romance of prestige. The forged letters mattered less for what they said than for what they allowed him to imagine about himself. And what of the Queen, who stood outside the fraud yet at its center? Here again, innocence did not protect because innocence was less narratively pleasing than guilt. The public had already been educated by pamphlets to imagine her as deceitful, extravagant, and sexually duplicitous. The affair therefore felt not like an exception, but like confirmation. This is one of the most dangerous moments in any political culture, when evidence begins arriving already pre-translated by appetite. Facts still exist, witnesses still speak, documents can still be examined, and verdicts can still be rendered. Yet none of these actions possesses the force of a story audiences are eager to keep. The aftermath wounded her more deeply than a simple accusation might have done. She found that the categories available to defend herself had collapsed. To say she had not wanted the necklace sounded false because she was already believed to want too much. To say she had not met the cardinal sounded false because secrecy had become her imagined natural element. To say forged letters existed sounded almost convenient. She could stand upright in court and speak plainly, but plainness no longer had political glamour. From that point onward, even her better instincts began arriving inside a poisoned atmosphere. A simpler gown could be called calculation, a maternal decision could be called manipulation, restraint itself might be read as stagecraft. Once public myth reaches that stage, the target lives under a peculiar form of suffocation. Every act breathes through a hostile interpretation before it reaches the world. That is what happened to Marie Antoinette. The Queen did not merely lose reputation. She lost control over the meanings of her own gestures. The financial crisis deepened like weather over stone. Men of figures, ministers of reform, old privileges, failed attempts at taxation, borrowed money, court expenses, military debts, grain shortages, and the relentless arithmetic of an overburdened state all converged into a national mood that no ceremonial language could absorb. It is easy to imagine kingdoms collapsing in noise. More often they first collapse in paperwork, in ledgers no one can reconcile, in promises whose interest cannot be serviced without political pain, in the widening gap between what institutions say and what they can actually bear. For ordinary French people, the crisis was less abstract. It was bread, or the lack of it. It was the uncertainty of market days. It was the sight of children eating poorly. It was the awareness that those who worked hardest and possessed least were asked to steady a kingdom whose privileged orders continued to shelter themselves behind habit and exemption. Such conditions create moral fury because they place visible comfort beside visible deprivation. Versailles might once have signified continuity and glory. Under these pressures, it began to signify insulation. It would be comforting to say that Marie Antoinette finally read the nation correctly and changed her life in time. The truth is sadder and more human. She changed unevenly. Loss affected her. Maternity softened some habits and sharpened her attachments. Private grief, especially after the deaths and illnesses of children, drew her away from the more careless rhythms of her early years. Yet deep structures of royal living remained around her like air itself. To reduce spending was not simply to decide modestly. It was to disturb networks of merchants, courtiers, and expectations. To be queen was to sit at the center of an expensive machine and not fully understand how the machine had become the object of hatred. This does not excuse, it clarifies. One of the recurring tragedies in royal history is that individuals raised inside symbolic systems often confuse the maintenance of those systems with the maintenance of order itself. Marie Antoinette was not a deep political thinker, suddenly choosing selfishness over reform. She was a woman trained to believe monarchy was natural. Ceremonial expenditure was structural, and criticism, when it came, was often merely malicious or temporary. By the time she realized criticism had become something heavier than court noise, France had already moved too far. And so the Estates General opened under all the old signs of spectacle. Violet silk, silver embroidery, ranked processions, precious surfaces, long rehearsed forms. Yet beneath the forms lay a different emotional arithmetic. Delegates from the Third Estate did not look at magnificence and see reassurance. Many saw indictment, the same embroidery that once certified order now measured distance. It is one of history's most painful ironies that institutions often display themselves most elaborately at the exact moment they have lost the power to persuade. When the women marched to Versailles, the revolution acquired a body that could not be ignored from behind glass. Hunger has a way of restoring scale. Arguments about sovereignty, constitutions, and privilege may still be debated in chambers, but the march of women, carrying knives, pikes, anger, and the memory of empty kitchens, translates crisis into something that even a court can no longer misunderstand. Their feet crossed the miles that etiquette had long pretended were impassable. Their presence announced that the distance between ruler and ruled had become physically intolerable. It matters that they were women. Royal femininity and popular femininity met each other across class, hunger, and spectacle. The Queen, so often attacked through images of excess, now faced women whose bodies bore the labor and deprivation of the kingdom. The confrontation was therefore more than political. It was symbolic, almost theatrical in the deepest historical sense. Different models of womanhood, different relations to food, motherhood, domestic labor, and public voice had arrived on the same stage. No wonder memory kept this scene alive. The violence of the night and the desecration of the Queen's rooms are often retold for their shock, but what lingers in a slower telling is the collapse of threshold. Private chambers were entered, bedding was torn, luxury was violated with a rage sharpened by exclusion. The crowd did not need legal theory to communicate its message. The message was that no curtain, no corridor, no title, and no powdered hierarchy would keep need outside any longer. And then the balcony, a queen beside her children, visible to those who had imagined her for years. There is a stillness in such moments that often precedes collective decision. The crowd had called for many things already, now it watched. What it saw was not resolution, but contact. One may debate whether her gestures were courage, instinct, performance, or all at once. History rarely gives us pure motives. What it does give us is a public body learning that its symbols can be exposed and still survive one more hour. The return to Paris afterward resembled a parody of royal procession. A family once escorted by ritual now moved beneath the force of popular will. The same roads that had once offered applause now offered escort of a different sort. The Queen did not yet know how much smaller her world would become, only that it had changed category. The palace had not protected her. The crowd had touched the heart of monarchy and found it vulnerable. Life in Paris under surveillance was defined not by one dramatic scene, but by accumulation. A narrowed corridor here, a watched conversation there, fewer walks, fewer trusted intimates, more guards, more rumor, more dependence upon moods she could not control. The Tuileries was not a dungeon, yet in some ways it was more psychologically exacting than a dungeon might have been. It let the old appearance of position remain, while steadily removing the substance beneath it. To live in such a place is to inhabit contradiction daily. One is displayed and diminished at once, the Queen corresponded, hoped, worried, and increasingly turned toward family and foreign support. Her Austrian ties, always politically dangerous, now grew fatal in meaning. Every letter could be imagined as treason. Every appeal for help could be read as confirmation that she belonged emotionally elsewhere. Again, there was just enough truth available to sustain the worst version. She did look beyond France. She did hope that external pressure might restore what internal politics had already stripped away. She had not learned the revolutionary lesson that monarchy could no longer assume the nation as its natural vessel. Varennes exposed this with merciless clarity. The escape plan was cumbersome, hesitant, badly matched to urgency, and doomed not only by logistics but by symbolism. A monarch caught fleeing from his own people confirms in one image what years of debate may struggle to fix. When the family was brought back, silence often accompanied the route more chillingly than noise. Public contempt had matured, the old theater of royalty had been reversed. Now the audience watched not to receive power, but to measure its reduction. For Marie Antoinette, failure at Varennes was both external and interior. It extinguished the lingering belief that return was possible. Before, she might still have imagined restoration, reassertion, or some rearrangement of events in which monarchy endured, chastened but recognizable. Afterward, the horizon darkened. She could still act, plead, write, endure, persuade her husband, attempt influence, and hope for foreign intervention, but she could no longer not know that the people had seen through the royal body and found it weak. The family thus moved from watched royalty toward explicit captivity. The temple would later make the transformation architectural. But the deeper captivity began earlier, when political meaning fixed itself around their persons so completely that no private intention could move without public conversion. To be seen at that stage is not to be known. It is to be enclosed inside other people's uses of your face. The temple prison was in some ways the perfect anti-Versailles. Where Versailles multiplied rooms, the prison compressed them. Where Versailles brightened bodies, the prison dimmed them. Where Versailles staged service, the prison staged humiliation. Yet both spaces shared one essential feature. Neither allowed a truly private self to exist unobserved. In the palace, observation came dressed in rank. In the prison, it came dressed in hostility. The queen had moved from ornamented scrutiny to punitive scrutiny, but scrutiny remained. Her husband deteriorated in his own way, and the children's worlds narrowed around adult decisions they could not understand. There are details from this period that resist easy telling because they belong not to public history alone, but to intimate damage. A mother hears her son's voice altered by coercion. A child becomes material for accusation. A family that once suffered from too much visibility now suffers from the deliberate corruption of its inner attachments. Such events do not need embellishment. Their cruelty lies in their ordinariness within a system that has decided dehumanization is politically useful. The death of Louis XVI created a hollow new silence. Whatever had not worked between them in life, they had still constituted a pair within ruin. His removal left her exposed to a different kind of solitude, one in which grief itself could not be properly performed because grief was politically interpreted. She could not simply mourn as a widow, she had to mourn under guard, as the widow of a man now officially transformed from king into enemy. Even bereavement was nationalized, and yet the testimonies and letters that survive from these months suggest a further inward change. Stripped of luxury, stripped of illusions, stripped even of family wholeness, Marie Antoinette seems finally to have become more exact in feeling and expression. Suffering did not make her politically brilliant. It did, however, force sincerity where role-playing had once been enough. The woman who had once escaped through surfaces now had almost no surface left to escape into. Depth, when it came as necessity. This is why the prison sections, handled quietly, can be among the sleepiest and saddest parts of the story. Not because nothing happens, but because everything significant happens at reduced volume. A hand on a child's shoulder, a letter half composed, a night without sleep. A body losing weight, a strand of hair whitening. The history of nations continues outside. But inside the room, history becomes the management of pain by hour, by gesture, by breath. The conciergerie intensified that reduction. Here the queen waited not for uncertain political outcome, but for a judicial script already leaning toward death. Her cell was meaner, narrower, more exposed to the gaze of guards who understood well enough that humiliation degrades before a sentence need ever do so. The body, once dressed and redressed as the ceremonial center of court life, was now denied privacy in the most basic acts. It is hard to imagine a sharper historical contrast. The same woman who had once shivered while waiting for a high-ranking noblewoman to hand her a shift now changed clothes under the eyes of men appointed to watch her diminish. The prosecutors did not need consistency so much as emotional effect. She was accused through categories already available in public language: foreigner, conspirator, sexual deviant, bad mother, enemy of liberty, corrupter of the state. The legal procedure borrowed the appearance of order because revolutions, like monarchies, understand the value of form. But form and justice are not the same. A state can stage righteousness with extraordinary elegance while abandoning its substance entirely. Her lawyers had little time and less room. The process moved under the pressure of political appetite. Yet in the middle of this machinery, her own voice still appeared. Accounts differ in detail, as they always do, but enough survives to preserve the impression of a woman speaking with composure, answering plainly, and breaking visibly only when maternal obscenity crossed the line between political accusation and human indecency. Such moments matter not because they reverse verdicts, but because they reveal where the moral center of a scene truly lies. Sometimes history knows it at once, more often it takes generations. Sentence came as expected, which is to say, not gently but not surprisingly. She responded with the economy of someone whose world had already narrowed beyond theatrical panic. There is often less drama and acceptance than audiences desire. She wrote letters, or tried to. She thought of children. She thought of forgiveness. She passed one more night in a room that did not deserve the intimacy of her thoughts, and yet received them. This too is part of tragedy. The world often grants our clearest selves the poorest settings in which to appear. When morning opened, it opened plainly: white dress, bound hands. The route to the scaffold, the common cart chosen to emphasize reduction from queen to criminal. And yet status, once deeply internalized, has strange afterlives. Not in pride alone, but in bearing, posture, and the old instinct to spare another discomfort, even when one cannot spare one's own. Hence the apology, hence the steadiness, hence the unsettling of those who had come to witness degradation and instead encountered composure. After the execution, the revolution continued as if fed rather than satisfied. This is perhaps the greatest practical argument against symbolic blood politics. Once a society learns to imagine salvation through elimination, it rarely discovers at the first death that its hunger was misdirected. Instead, it often concludes that more deaths are required. Marie Antoinette's end did not restore bread, nor simplify governance, nor reconcile classes, nor calm factional rivalry. The machine turned on. Her children remained caught within that machinery. Marie-Thérèse survived, though survival under such conditions has costs that do not disappear at release. Louis Charles, twisted by confinement and manipulation, became one more proof that revolutions can wound the very innocence they claim to defend. The treatment of those children lingers in historical memory because it punctures propaganda at the level of instinct. One may argue doctrines for hours. It is harder to explain away what is done to a child. Across Europe, Marie Antoinette's death traveled quickly into palaces, chapels, newspapers, and diplomatic rooms. Monarchs saw warning, counter-revolutionaries saw a martyr, British propagandists saw material against France, Catholic sermonizers saw pious suffering, artists saw tragedy, writers saw the perfect contour of a fallen queen redeemed by composure. This widening afterlife reminds us that political death does not end interpretation. It multiplies it. Here again we move carefully. We do not need to rehearse every later use of her image to understand the transformation. In life, she had often failed to govern her own representation. In death, she became almost ungovernably useful. Those who had once needed her monstrous now needed to continue proving monstrosity to justify what had been done. Those who hated the revolution needed her sanctified. Romantic culture needed her softened, beautified, and transfigured into suffering nobility. Later historians would try to disassemble these versions and recover something more balanced. Whether balance is ever fully possible after such a life is another question. What matters for sleep and memory is the quieter conclusion. The person vanishes into an unmarked grave. The symbol expands. Yet beneath all later, symbolic work, the surviving scenes remain stubbornly human. The girl stripped of one identity at a border, the woman trying to breathe in a palace that watched her constantly. The mother leaning toward her children, the prisoner writing by poor light, the condemned woman apologizing for a small accident in the final minute of her life. These are the places where history, for all its appetite for abstraction, is forced back toward personhood. If we step back far enough, Marie Antoinette's story can be made to illustrate almost anything. The decadence of monarchy, the cruelty of revolution, the vulnerability of women in public life, the weaponization of sexuality in politics, the manufacture of scapegoats, the collision between image and reality, the transformation of personal suffering into historical symbol. All of those readings contain some truth. None is the whole of her. Perhaps that is why she remains strangely difficult to settle. Too frivolous in youth to be an uncomplicated heroine, too politically limited to be the mastermind of the nightmare once attributed to her, too privileged to be innocent in any simple sense, too dignified in death to remain the caricature her enemies require. Such figures continue to live because they resist clean moral filing. They ask more from us than condemnation or reverence. They ask patience, and patience may be the best thing to carry into sleep. Not the patience that excuses, but the patience that watches a person move through systems larger than herself and notices where blindness becomes suffering, where comfort becomes insulation, where gossip becomes propaganda, where politics becomes theater, and where in the end, a self may emerge more clearly precisely because almost everything else has been taken away. There is melancholy in that, also a kind of tenderness. So let the final room grow very quiet now. Imagine not the shouting crowd, but the silence after wheels have passed. Imagine not the bright hall of mirrors, but its darkness after candles are out. Imagine the prison corridor after footsteps recede. Imagine a folded sheet of paper left behind, the ink dry, the light poor, the hand tired. History keeps its grand events, of course, but human understanding often survives in smaller remnants. This is where we leave her, not triumphant, not vindicated in the simple sense, not cleansed of every foolishness, but no longer reducible to the uses others made of her. A woman late in wisdom, early in suffering, and unexpectedly strong when stripped of almost everything that had once defined her. The gilded cage could not educate her in time, the stone cell did. That is not justice, it is tragedy. But tragedy, when it is quiet enough, sometimes leaves behind not only sorrow, but a more careful way of seeing. And if sleep is close now, let the story settle without verdict. Let there be only the faint reflection of candlelight in glass, the chill of a corridor, the softness of a child's hair beneath a mother's hand, the rough wood of the cart, the pale October light, and then and beyond all of it, the merciful dark in which symbols finally loosen and the person, for a little while, may simply rest. In the years after her death, memory did what institutions had already done in life. It selected, arranged, sharpened, concealed. Revolutionary pamphlets continued printing versions of her suited to ongoing need. If the queen had died with too much dignity, then pamphleteers could correct the record through invention. If witnesses remembered composure, propagandists could publish panic. If letters revealed forgiveness, polemicists could answer with obscenity. Printing presses are merciless in times of upheaval, because paper can continue the work of the scaffold by other means. Yet, propaganda never has the field entirely to itself. Servants remember differently. Jailers remember unintentionally. Painters sketch what they see, and not only what they are told to see. Relatives preserve letters. Enemies themselves admit, in private, to unease. History is never pure victory for narrative control. It is a long contest between imposed meaning and surviving detail. The courtesy to the executioner survived, so did the letters. So did the memory of white hair, plain dress, and composure. So did the accounts of grief for children and of physical decline under captivity. There is something instructive in that survival of detail. Large political stories often depend on simplification, but human memory clings to the small. A nation may remember treason. A witness remembers how tired someone looked. A regime may declare monstrosity. A guard remembers a voice. A crowd may cheer, yet later individuals remember discomfort at what they saw. These tiny resistances to total simplification do not always save the living. They do, however, complicate the dead in ways propaganda resents. The fate of Marie Thérèse and Louis Charles intensified this complication. A revolution that had insisted it stood with the people did not know what to do with children who embodied monarchy yet suffered visibly as children. To leave them untouched would invite dynastic sentiment. To handle them harshly would expose moral contradiction. France chose contradiction. The result was damage that no ideological language could justify without sounding hollow. Every later account of their imprisonment told a little more sympathy back toward the family the revolution had tried to flatten into emblem. And so the afterlife of Marie Antoinette became inseparable from the afterlife of those children. Her story no longer belonged solely to the politics of court and crowd. It belonged also to nursery, prison corridor, sickbed, and unfinished adolescence. In that shift from abstract symbol to damaged family, the old revolutionary certainty lost some of its shine. A monster can be executed without grief. A mother separated from her children remains harder to hate cleanly. Outside France, royal courts received the news of her death as more than family tragedy. It felt like a tear in the fabric of monarchy itself. To modern ears, this may sound grandiose, but 18th century Europe was still ordered by dynastic imagination. Queens were sisters, daughters, nieces, diplomatic links, and visible emblems of an order presumed ancient even when it was brittle. To see one publicly executed by her own people was to discover that the old insulation of rank had thinned catastrophically. In Vienna, Naples, London, St. Petersburg, and the smaller courts scattered through the German states, Marie Antoinette's death quickly became a lesson. Some rulers drew from it the need for stronger police, stronger censorship, stronger armies, stronger barricades against the political imagination of ordinary people. Others drew a more fearful lesson, that reform delayed too long may radicalize what might once have been negotiated. Both lessons would shape 19th century Europe. Repression deepened in some places, reform sharpened in others, everywhere. Her death remained available as warning. Religious Europe read the story through still another lens. The letters of forgiveness, the composure, the widowhood, the maternal grief, the acceptance of death, all of these could be arranged into martyrdom. This did not happen because churchmen suddenly became accurate historians. It happened because suffering born visibly tends to invite religious interpretation in societies accustomed to reading pain through spiritual narrative. The queen once attacked for frivolity became, in some circles, a woman purified by ordeal. Such transformations tell us as much about the needs of those interpreting as about the life interpreted. Artists and writers soon joined this work of reimagining. They preferred contrast, youth and age, palace and prison, satin and straw, mirrors and bars, laughter and silence, the blush of court and the white of the final morning. Romantic culture especially loves a fall that ends in dignity. It requires not blamelessness but emotional contour, and Marie Antoinette's life offered it abundantly. Thus a woman who had once been consumed as gossip was slowly recast as tragedy. The same culture that had delighted in her humiliation found later pleasure in her sorrow. This should not surprise us. Publics are rarely consistent in their moral appetites. They can hate extravagance in one decade and sentimentalize it in the next if the right amount of suffering intervenes. Memory is not justice, it is arrangement. Yet even arrangements can reveal. The desire to recast Marie Antoinette as a tragic heroine showed that the revolutionary image of pure monstrosity could not hold permanent. Human beings kept noticing too much that did not fit it. Modern historians, arriving much later with colder methods and more access to archives, have tried to walk between legend and denunciation. They have found a woman neither innocent nor monstrous, neither political mastermind nor empty doll, but someone formed badly for the responsibilities history placed upon her. She was shallow in some ways, incurious in others, expensive in tastes, sheltered in understanding, and often politically naive. She was also loyal to those she loved, deeply attached to her children, capable of sincerity, vulnerable to enclosure, and unexpectedly composed under extreme pressure. These things can coexist. In real people, they usually do. It also matters that she was a woman, not because gender explains everything, but because it explains much about the style of hatred directed at her. Men in power are accused of ambition, tyranny, or incompetence. Women in power are often accused through the body first. Vanity, appetite, corruption, seduction, foreignness in the emotional sense. Motherhood, measured against impossible standards. Femininity itself, reframed as threat. Marie Antoinette received all of this in abundance. Her spending was feminized, her friendships were sexualized, her influence was made unnatural, her foreign birth was eroticized into disloyalty. The attacks succeeded partly because they activated fears larger than her. To notice this is not to convert her into an uncomplicated feminist martyr. It is to see more clearly how political cultures work when they need a woman to bear collective resentment. The methods used against her have not disappeared. Personal life made public, appetite made political, style converted into evidence of moral failure, nationality turned into suspicion, maternal fitness weaponized, intimate rumor elevated into public truth. None of this is confined to the 18th century. In that sense, her story remains disturbingly current. And then, there is the other lesson, the quieter and more difficult one. People can change under pressure, though not always usefully and not always soon enough. Marie Antoinette did not become wise in time to save the monarchy, nor disciplined in time to repair public trust. But she did become, by many surviving accounts, more serious, more inwardly exact, and more morally steady under suffering than anyone who knew only the early queen might have predicted. We are uncomfortable with such transformations because they do not simplify judgment. Yet history that comforts too easily is usually poor history. For a bedtime telling, perhaps that is where the deepest rest lies, not in deciding too quickly what she was, but in holding the tension between folly and dignity long enough for a fuller human shape to emerge. A girl crossed a border. A queen lost herself in ceremony. A public image hardened around her. A nation collapsed. A prison reduced her. A final morning revealed composure. After that, memory argued over the meaning. It still does. There is one more way to look at the palace and the prison, and it may be the gentlest with which to end. Both were systems built on watching. At Versailles, the queen was watched in silk. In the conciergerie and the temple, she was watched in decline. In both spaces, others believed observation gave them ownership of her meaning. Courtiers thought they knew her because they saw her dressed, seated, entering, exiting, receiving, favoring, retreating. Guards thought they knew her because they saw her weaken, write, pray, weep, or remain composed. The public thought it knew her because pamphlets supplied scenes vivid enough to stand in for contact. Yet seeing and knowing are not the same. Perhaps that is why the last surviving impressions are so strikingly modest. Not a great policy, not a diplomatic strategy, not a speech that changed the age, a gesture, a letter, a bedside grief, a hallway, a hand reaching toward a child, a worn body standing upright in a moving cart. These details do not excuse the old regime. They do not erase hunger. They do not repair injustice. What they do is return humanity to a life that public myth had tried to flatten. And whenever humanity returns, even partially, sleep becomes possible in the story. The nervous system no longer braces only for spectacle. It begins to feel the slow rhythm of a person moving through rooms. So imagine the rooms now one by one, not as museums, not as tourist sites, not as arguments, but as spaces still holding traces of a life. The border pavilion where old garments were removed. The carriage interior where a frightened girl looked out on a staged France. The hall of mirrors before dawn, empty of courtiers, reflecting only candle stubs and pale sky. A smaller chamber at the Petit Trianon where laughter once sounded briefly like freedom. a nursery, after the children have been carried to bed. The Tuileries under watch, quieter than Versailles and more dangerous in its quiet. A prison room where rough walls absorb the sound of prayer. A courtroom in which a voice rises plainly and does not alter the verdict. A final cart rolling slowly under a gray morning, then nothing but aftermath. History rarely grants so clean a sequence in life, of course. One room leaks into another. The prison is already latent in the palace. The scaffold is already latent in the pamphlet. The child on the border carries the old age of white hair, somewhere invisibly inside time. But story lets us walk the corridor more slowly than life did. It allows us to feel how one enclosure prepared the nerves for another. How forced display and luxury may teach the body a strange endurance later useful in humiliation and pain. The gilded cage did not morally improve her, but it trained her in being watched, and perhaps that training, cruelly repurposed, helped her face the last watching of all. If that is true, then even here there is a melancholy symmetry. Versailles tried to create submission through ritual. The revolution tried to create confession through terror. Neither succeeded entirely. Something remained in her untouched by both. Not innocence, not greatness, but a final reserve of composure. It was small. It was human. And because it was human, it has outlived most of the political language that once tried to define her. As the night deepens, the sharper arguments around her life can be allowed to loosen. We do not need to settle every debate before sleep. We do not need to decide exactly how guilty, how blind, how vain, how redeemable, how tragic, or how politically significant she was. What we can do is notice the shape of the journey. A life that began in arrangement became enclosure. Enclosure produced escape. Escape fed image. Image fed blame. Blame fed revolution. Revolution fed captivity. Captivity uncovered the person beneath the image. Death enlarged the symbol again. And now, in memory, the person and the symbol continue to drift around each other like reflections that never fully merge. That drifting is perhaps the most truthful ending available. It is tempting to seal stories with moral certainty, to say this death proved that. This queen represented this. This revolution taught that. But the deeper histories rarely rest so neatly. Marie Antoinette's life shows how institutions fail, how privilege blinds, how rumor devours, how politics sexualizes and scapegoats, how violence expands once justified, and how a person may still discover dignity too late for victory, but not too late for meaning. That is already more than enough for one night, so let the air cool around the story now. Let the candles gutter lower in the palace and the prison alight. Let the paper of the last letters grow still on the table. Let the crowd disperse into distance, the wheels stop turning, the footsteps thin out, the doors close softly. Somewhere beyond ideology and accusation, beyond opera and pamphlet, beyond satin and straw, beyond motherhood and monarchy and murder, there remains one final quiet fact, that a human being passed through all this and did not become exactly what either her admirers or her enemies required. And that may be the final gentle comfort here. No machine, whether royal or revolutionary, ever completely succeeded in owning her inner life. Not the protocol that tried to dress it, not the propaganda that tried to narrate it, not the court that tried to condemn it, not even history, which keeps returning to her because she cannot be made to stay in one moral category for long. If you carry anything from her story into sleep, let it be that small resistance, the possibility that even inside the most artificial, punitive, or theatrical systems, something unmanageable by the system can survive. Now the palace is very far away, the prison too. The voices fade. The mirrors hold only darkness. The white dress becomes only a pale brush of memory. The name itself drifts, lighter now, no longer needing to stand for every excess of a dying regime, or every cruelty of a rising republic. It can simply belong for a final moment to a person who suffered, changed, and met the end more calmly than the age around her deserved. Let that be enough. Let the rest dissolve. Let the room grow dim. let history fall quiet, and let sleep come gently.